Thank you for taking the time to view my screencast today. I've been doing a lot of reading and research in the realm of instructional walkthroughs and instructional rounds as a means for improvement in education across the system. And in nearly every text that I read, there's reference to some type of work from Elizabeth City, Richard Elmore, Sarah Fiarman, or Teitel. And the majority of the work points back to this book, Instructional Rounds in Education, a networked approach to improving teaching and learning. So I thought for this project, I should be using this text as one of the foundational texts for my work. So Instructional Rounds in Education focuses on the concept that there are pockets of excellence throughout our schools and our school systems, and that our challenge is to bring those pockets of excellence to scale, to provide for all what our systems currently provide for some. So this book talks a lot about the theories behind instructional rounds and why they're necessary, but also provides a framework and protocols for doing just this, for taking those excellent practices and bringing them to scale across the system so that all students have equal access to excellence. So City, Elmore, Fiarman, and Teitel talk about this challenge. And the challenge is that we are asking schools to do something they have never done before. Educate all students to high levels. And we don't know how to do that in every classroom for every child. So this framework that's outlined in this text talks about one of the ways that you can begin to educate all students at high levels across that system by having disciplined frameworks and protocols that are grounded in research. So Elmore says this, that teaching is not a rocket science. It is, in fact, far more complex and demanding work than rocket science. And the authors say we can do more together than we can do individually to improve learning and teaching. And that's an undercurrent throughout this entire book, that idea of collective practice in that collaborative community of practice environment. So with that, at the heart of a community of practice, there has to be leadership that's leading the way to bridge the gap between educators and their practice. So this book really brings all of those pieces together to try to begin to make systemic changes by examining closely what language we use and how we can put language to the notion of effective instruction. So the big concepts in a nutshell are these: that all educators should be immersed in a common practice that is disciplined by protocols and routines and organized around the core functions of schooling in order to create common language, ways of seeing, and a shared practice for improvement within a community of practice. So that's really the heart of this text. So what are instructional rounds exactly? How are we going to do that? First, instructional rounds are a disciplined framework that supports all educators so they can work together to improve instruction. Next, it's a disciplined way to build capacity by establishing a common language around understanding effective practice and how to support it. Next, it's a way to connect classroom observations within the rounds model to the larger context of the system's improvement strategies. We talk a lot in this text about how every system has some kind of improvement strategy, and very often we say that classroom evaluations and observations are linked, but very often they're not, because we're focusing on the individual and improving an individual, not focusing on improving the system as a collective. So this framework of instructional rounds provides the framework so participants can focus on a problem of practice that cuts across all levels of the system. And we'll talk a little bit more about defining a problem of practice later, but the key here is that this problem of practice that's identified cuts across all the levels of the system, bringing focused attention. So what's the difference between instructional rounds and observations and evaluations? So first, the learning stance. In instructional rounds, the learning stance is one of inquiry-based, and it's a collaborative community of practice, where in evaluations, it's more directive. The main learner is the one being observed. So then the unit of improvement in instructional rounds is the collective or the system. We want to improve all within the system. Where evaluation, it's very nice that we want to improve the system, but in reality, we're really just trying to improve the individual. And the belief there is that through evaluation, we can improve one person at a time. And with each person we improve, the collective gets stronger. In instructional rounds, there's accountability that's lateral and that's peer-to-peer, where in evaluation, it's much more of a top-down approach to accountability. And that's the same in instructional rounds. The focus is on the instructional core. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's the core, the instructional core, versus in the evaluation model, the focus is on primarily the teacher and improving the teacher. So a snapshot of instructional rounds. First, we identify that problem of practice that I spoke about a minute ago. And a problem of practice is the specific problem of instructional improvement that the school and the school system are wrestling with and would like the network's feedback on. And in this case, when we talk about network, in the instructional rounds, it's that team of people who are networked together for the purpose of improving instruction. So first they have to identify what is that problem of practice. Once it's identified, you go and observe. The network divides into smaller groups that visit a rotation of 4 to 5 classrooms for approximately 20 minutes each, and they gather descriptive evidence related to the problem of practice. Once you have the evidence, you debrief. Here, the network works through the debrief process to describe, analyze, and predict based on the body of evidence collected. And I just want to also say that this process is one that takes some time to develop at each stage, and the book really outlines some protocols that are necessities at each of these different stages to make sure that you're creating that collective and that networked approach. Finally, once you've debriefed, you really need to focus, and the network discusses the next level of work and makes recommendations for the school system to make progress on the problem of practice, staying very much focused on that problem of practice and what's the next step we can take to show improvement in that one area. So making meaningful and productive changes in instructional practice requires us to confront how we upset and in some sense reprogram our past ways of doing things. How do we make those changes so that we can begin to do things differently? So the instructional core that I spoke of during the evaluation and instructional rounds slide is this notion that the instructional core focuses on the relationship between the teacher, the student, and the content, and how those three things interact with one another. And the book talks a lot about how these three things work in relationship to each other, and how very often practices of the past focus in on only one of these areas and not all three together. So the instructional task is at the center of the instructional core, and the task is the actual work that students are asked to do in the process of instruction. not what teachers think they're asking students to do or what the curriculum says that students are asked to do, but instead really focusing on what they actually asked students to do. And the authors talk about their work and how they've gone out to schools and they've talked to teachers about what the students are doing. And when they analyze the work the students are actually producing, there's a disconnect there between what teachers think they're asking and what they're actually asking. So success depends on understanding exactly what has to change in the instructional core. Thus, the instructional core anchors the practice of rounds and any other systems level instructional improvement process. So you have to look at those three pieces, how they all fit together, and decide what is the problem of practice within those three systems, those three core pieces. And if you need to identify that first before setting out on rounds or making any kind of instructional improvement. So there are 7 principles of the instructional core. First, increases in student learning only occur as a consequence of improvements in the level of content, teachers' knowledge and skill, and student engagement. So again, that goes back to that instructional core. And if you change any single element of the core, you have to change the other 2. So, for example, the text talks a lot about these curricular projects where we maybe update curriculum, but we never actually give the teachers additional content training, and how that offsets the balance and can never produce meaningful improvement because we have a great curriculum, but teachers are not prepared to deliver it. So with that, you start to have that disconnect where teachers are teaching the same way with high-level content. And then if you can't see it in the core, it's not there. So this is another piece where the authors talk about, they describe the scenario where it's very common in today's school when you go into a team meeting and you see the team members steeped in discussion regarding student work and teachers trying to understand how some students fared more positively than others. And you start to see patterns that in maybe one of the classrooms, the students didn't do as well as another, and teachers start to dig down deep. And one of the things that they often see is that teachers wind up saying they must not have come to me with the skills prepared to do this complex work. However, when the authors look in all of the classrooms across the grade level, they see that there's a significant disconnect and variability between student performance as a result of the teaching and the tasks that students are asked to do instead of the prior knowledge that students are coming in with. So that ties into 4, looking closely at the task, and that the task predicts performance. So the only way to find out what students are actually doing is to observe what they're actually doing, not asking teachers after the fact or asking teachers to look at student work, but just looking at the task as students complete it in the moment. 5 is this notion that the real accountability system is the tasks that students are asked to do. And that from policy and procedural standpoint, we have to think if we tend to think that we're just getting the incentives and structures right in a good place, that we will have systematic improvement, is not the way we should be looking at it. But in fact, this view of accountability tends to be unfounded because it tends to fall under the assumption that teachers know what they should be doing, they know how to do it, and that they're invested in getting it done. So instead, this 5th principle talks about how a district must invest the energy in building the confidence of leaders to observe and analyze and affect instructional practice across the systems. And with that said, those same leaders need to learn to do the work by doing the work, not by telling other people to do the work, not by having it done, the work at some time in the past, and not by hiring experts who can act as proxies for our knowledge about how to do the work. And 7, description before analysis, analysis before prediction, and prediction before evaluation. So this is just a reminder that you have to first invest the time and energy into understanding and sharing descriptive language together as a team, and really outlining what that common culture of instruction looks like, so that you can develop a language over time. And then once you have that language, you can start to do the work of analysis, where you work together to observe and take the common takeaways and put them into mutually agreed upon categories to start making some judgments about how the categories are related to each other before making any predictions about why things are or how things should work. But following this process before any evaluation takes place is essential to enacting change in instructional rounds. So once you understand these concepts about instructional rounds and the principles of the instructional core, you start to develop theories of action. So the need for theories of action, it's essential to understand that school systems and schools are not blank slates waiting to be written on by leaders, but instead they're composites and collections of previous solutions to problems typically identified by others. And that the systems usually embody beliefs and practices that are deeply rooted in people's identities that can't be erased or displaced with another's vision. And last, schools and school systems represent an equilibrium state, however dysfunctional, that accurately reflects the comfort zone of the people who work in them. So what are theories of action exactly? So they're based off the work of Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen in their studies of individual and organizational learning. And their work focuses on the distinction between individual theories of actions, which describe how people intend to act in the world, and what they call their theories of use, which describe how they actually act. So their work focused on closing that gap between the theory of action, what they intend, and the theory of use, what they actually do. And it distinguishes between single loop and double loop learning. So they describe single loop learning as describing the learning that occurs when we act on the world, receive feedback on the consequences of our actions, and then adapt our behavior to that feedback. Where double loop is the learning that is the process of a single loop with the additional stage of reflection on the process by which we read and adapt to the consequences of our actions and try to improve how we learn from our actions. So the keys there really that stage of reflection, and then to try to improve how we learn from our actions. So that's essential. And that reflective piece. So the capacity to engage in double loop learning is what the authors say distinguishes more successful and less successful individuals and organizations. Reflection and action creates learning. And when we move from the individual to collective, we separate people and their practice. We cultivate trust and build efficacy. Then we're on a path to transforming schools. So as I start to wrap up here, the instructional rounds can be seen as processes. So first, it can be seen as a culture building process where shared practice, disciplined by those protocols I outlined before and routines, and organized around the core functions of school in order to create common language, ways of seeing, and shared practice for improvement. can also be seen as a learning process where the knowledge and support that most schools receive fall in an organization that is weakly equipped to use these offerings because it doesn't have the internal structures or processes and norms that are necessary to pick up the knowledge and deploy it in classrooms. So it could be seen as culture process, a learning process, and last, it's as a political process because the rounds process carries with it a set of assumptions about the values of knowledge and educators bring to their work. And it consolidates the knowledge and ways that increase the professional authority of educators. And we know that, like any idea that attempts to alter the distribution of knowledge and authority in society, the rounds process is not a politically neutral idea. So we're trying to take the work of the profession and elevate it. And that's one of the things that the authors talk a lot about throughout this book, is that education is an industry, as they describe it, that is trying to be professional without professional practices. So they say that we must infuse professional practices before we can ever say that we are professional. And this, as instructional rounds, is one piece to increasing the professional authority of educators. So the 5 key takeaways really: who? Individuals learn within a collective and contribute to the development and testing of a clear theory of action of systemic improvement. What? Instructional rounds is a specific practice embedded within a larger system. It works best when coupled with clear, collaborative learning culture that values human skill and knowledge. Where? Instructional rounds provides the setting that supports the creation of common language and agreements about what constitutes effective instruction. When? Instructional rounds is most effective when it moves from being an additional activity to being the work. The work is the routines and practices that constitutes the collective responsibility of all within the system. And they talk a lot about that as the work, and they often have it in quotes throughout the book, that people must begin to focus together collectively on the work that needs to be done within the system. And why? Instructional rounds is a way to move education from a collection of independent practitioners nestled in a bureaucratic structure to a profession with a shared set of practices, a body of collective knowledge, and a set of mutual commitments that define professional accountability. So those are my 5 key takeaways from this text. And in the end, once you look across all of those 5 things, it really talks about letting the culture that you create through rounds drive the work that needs to be done through the school. And it focuses on the need for trust and efficacy. But if you let that culture drive the work, the system will improve. So I thank you for taking the time to listen to my screencast about my key takeaways in Elmore, City, Fiarman, and Teitel's book, Instructional Rounds in Education, a Network Approach to Improving Teaching and Learning. Thank you so much.